Good morning, everyone. Hi, this is John Elcesser. For those of you who I've not had the pleasure to meet, I'm the Executive Director of the Indiana Non-Public Education Association. Joining me here in my office is Heidi Harmon, our Director of Communications and Member Relations. And appreciate you taking the time to be a part of what we're calling a web conversation. Very timely topic, I'm sure, especially all of you folks in the high school or graduation pathways is on your radar. I hope so. Have a great turnout today, so I'm guessing that means that it's a very timely topic. I did want to point out that our approach is going to be a little bit different with this webinar. That's why we're calling it a web conversation, because our approach today is not to have the limelight on me doing presentation, but it's to have the limelight on you so that you can learn from each other in terms of things that you're doing in terms of the implementation of the graduation pathways. Today we're doing the session for high school leaders, guidance counselors, and we will be doing another session tomorrow for elementary, middle school folks in terms of what their part is in preparing for graduation pathways, especially related to career awareness and career exploration. So let me share with you the agenda, and this is kind of what our approach is going to be. I'm going to do a quick overview, run through some things. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on general kind of topics that hopefully you're aware of at this particular point, but I'm going to kind of dig in a little bit deeper to some of the weeds issues, because those are things I think that we're going to want to discuss. After I go through the overview, then Heidi will be dividing you up into discussion groups. We did this one other time relatively effectively. Hopefully it will be today. But since we have, potentially 40 people or so online, which is a little hard to have a discussion, so we will be automatically dividing you up into groups. We'll talk a little bit more about how that's going to work in just a little bit. Then we're going to ask you to report back basically on 3 areas. What were some of the best practices that you heard in your discussion in your small group? What were some consistent challenges that schools are facing as it relates to the implementation of graduation pathways? And then what do you need to know more about? How can we provide additional information? The focus, as I said, not what you're going to be learning from me today, but what you're going to be learning from each other. You should have received an email from Heidi both Friday and then again this morning, which has the discussion questions. So that way you've had the opportunity to look at that, so you're kind of not caught off guard and having to answer, off the cuff. So hopefully you had a chance to look at those, think about those in relation to your particular school. I encourage you to have those available to you. Once we divide up into groups, you'll have to rely on that, although we will be chatting out some instructions as well. And then we're going to ask you, or ask at least one person who would capture some of those notes, to email those notes to Heidi after the web conference today, and I'll share with you on a slide what her email address is. So that's kind of the game plan for this morning. Like any of these web conferences through Zoom, you have the ability to chat. You can chat to everyone, or you can chat individually to me, which both Heidi and I will receive. If you have a question and you want to, raise your hand, feel free to stop me. Like I said, I'm going to try to move through the presentation part of this pretty quickly so that we allow a good 25, maybe even 30 minutes for you to discuss in small groups, and then we'll bring back and report out what we've heard. Hopefully this document is not unfamiliar to all of you on the call. This is basically the structure for graduation pathways. And as you're well aware, currently to graduate from an Indiana high school, you have to meet diploma requirements and pass a GQE, which right now is I-Step 10. All of that is changing with these graduation pathways, and there's also changes coming out. I'm not going to get into any great depth of legislation that's being addressed in the General Assembly this year, but there's some things that are going to impact graduation pathways, at least on the accountability side and how high schools get accountability grades. So as you know, we've now moved to kind of a 3-bucket approach where you have to meet high school diploma requirements, and we now have 4 designations in which schools can do that. I think they're also working on, in legislation, an alternative diploma for special needs students as well. The second bucket deals with employability skills, and this can be demonstrated through project-based, service-based, or work-based learning experiences. And then finally, demonstrating post-secondary readiness competencies, and there are 9 particular ways that we can do that. As I said, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on those that you are probably most familiar with, but maybe dig a little bit deeper into a few of the areas just to make sure that that's on your radar as you are looking at strategies locally in terms of how you're going to implement graduation pathways at your particular school. I'm going to just check, if you don't mind, a second here. I see some chat questions coming up.
We're good. I got to take care of.
Okay, some folks said they did not receive the questions, and I think Heidi's taken care of that, so we'll continue on. So let's talk about, first of all, bucket number 1, if I can get my slide to advance. Here we go. I already mentioned those diploma options, which you're well aware of. It's not really different than what it has been in the past, although now technically we have 1 diploma with 4 designations rather than 4 diplomas. There is some legislation being addressed this session, which may not impact us significantly, but just so you're aware, that would allow schools to substitute some CTE courses for requirements on an academic honors diploma, as long as that course is of equal rigor. Again, I'm not going to go in extensively to that, and that's something if you have individual questions about for me, feel free to email me, and I'd be happy to provide some additional information. As we talk about bucket 2, which deals with employability skills, and basically it deals with the idea of when students graduate, whether they go to college initially or go into the workforce, somewhere down the road they're going to be entering a workforce, and there are some soft skills that kids need to have, students need to have, graduates need to have to be successful in the workforce. And that's what this particular bucket attempts to address. And they allow students to demonstrate those employability skills through one of 3 opportunities: through a project-based experience, a service-based experience, or a work-based experience. Some things that make sure that you're aware of. I think a lot of our schools, because we already have required service, are looking at that service-based experience as the direction where their school may go or will probably go. Please remember that there's a student work product that's required. It's supposed to be meeting design principles, and I'll share those with you here in just a second. And there are also benchmarks, employability skill benchmarks that you can find at the link on this website. And Heidi will email out this PowerPoint presentation to all the folks that are on the call afterwards. But those employability benchmarks basically cover 5 different areas. It talks about, those soft skills. What's the mindsets needed? What kind of self-management skills are required? What kind of learning strategies? What are the social skills needed? And what kind of workplace skills should students have as well to be successful in the workforce? This gives you the design principles in terms of whatever that service learning experience. And there are design principles for each of those 3 employability skills options. These are just the design principles for the service-based learning one. It has to be meaningful service. There needs to be a link to the curriculum. There has to be an opportunity for reflection in that process. We want to have diversity of kinds of opportunities available, and kids need to have some voice in selecting what the service learning option is that they are going to participate in. It requires having partnerships with some type of organization outside the schools, community-based or business-based, or some kind of service organization outside the school. Needs to be monitoring of progress, and there needs to be sufficient duration and intensity for that experience. So it's not like someone brings in cans for a food can drive and that meets that requirement. If we look now at bucket 3, you're familiar with most of these options. Receiving an honors diploma, hitting a benchmark college readiness benchmark score on the ACT or SAT, meeting a benchmark score on the ASVAB, achieving an industry certification, a federal apprenticeship opportunity, a CTE concentrator, meeting the AP IB dual credit Cambridge International or CLEP test requirement. And we can talk a little bit more about that in just a second, or the development of locally created pathways. Not going to get into that extensively today. We thought that was going to be really a great opportunity for creative kinds of options, but the state has really put some very narrow guardrails, making it a challenge to kind of successfully get a locally created pathway approved. There are only 2 that have been approved thus far. You can find those on the Department of Education's website. But if we look a little bit more specifically at some of the ones that may be a little more non-traditional as it relates to bucket 3, post-secondary readiness competencies. The ASVAB, there are different scores for different branches of the military for the ASVAB. The Army has the lowest, and that's the one that's required a minimum of 31. You know, when they put the ASVAB into the options available, there's been some concern that it would become a default kind of option for folks rather than technically a pathway to the military. We're watching that. There may be some pushback over time about the use of the ASVAB, but right now that is an allowable option in that bucket 3. Industry certification. Those certifications need to come from the Department of Workforce Development's approved list, which you can find on the Department of Education's website. I'm guessing that most of you, if not all of you, have been to the IDOE's website on graduation pathways. There are many, many resources that you can access from that web page. You just click on this particular aspect of bucket 3, and it will give you a link so that you can get see all of the approved DWD industry certifications. That may be one that schools may want to explore. There are some very rigorous certifications, and there are some that, at least on the surface, appear to be less rigorous. I saw that there was a certification for QuickBooks, and so if somebody meets that certification, they meet the bucket 3 eligibility for graduation, which I don't quite understand. But if you look at that list of certifications, that may provide some creative opportunities for you. Likewise, there is a list of federally recognized apprenticeships, and I have to be honest, I am less versed in that area. But you can see the different companies and businesses that have those apprenticeships available, again, on the DOE website. And then the CTE concentrator, these last 3 are the workforce option or workforce development opportunities. The CTE concentrator, and this one recently changed because of a federal definition that the students must earn a C average in at least 2 non-duplicative advanced courses. It originally was just 3 courses, but now it's at least 2 non-duplicative advanced courses, and that means beyond the introductory course level within a particular program or course of study. So since those are things that most of our schools have not probably engaged with, I wanted to kind of reference that, and if you are looking into that, hopefully that'll find its way into your discussion. I'm going to pause right there. Well, no, let me go to this second slide on bucket 3, excuse me. AP, IB, dual credit, Cambridge International, and CLEP. a C or higher in 3 courses. One, it should be of the 3, must be in a core content area. The scoring is a little bit different on a CLEP or the Cambridge International. And again, if you reference DOE guidance or FAQ, there's information available on the Cambridge International and CLEP. CLEP is another college board product. Doesn't have a curriculum associated with it. It's just an exam. Although I think there are some tutorials out there that people can access. But again, options that we may not typically have taken advantage of that are available as a post-secondary readiness competency. And then the locally created pathway, which I mentioned before, which has kind of become challenging in terms of schools addressing that. We were working on one, and we may revisit that. We were working on a ministry pathway. Initial feedback from state board staff was not positive, but in talking to DOE and others, it may be something that we want to bring to the front burner again and revisit. But to successfully have a locally created pathway approved by the state board, it has to be developed in collaboration or in partnership with a community organization or a business. There must be some kind of competency or currency that the student gets out of that particular pathway. And there has to be a commitment to continuous improvement, that you're measuring the outcomes in terms of students using that pathway and making changes and improving the process as needed. So with that, I'm going to pause a second and see if you have any chat questions. Please share those at this particular point, or if you want to raise your hand, hopefully we can find a way to unmute you to address that. Otherwise, we're going to continue on to the discussion part of the.
They can unmute themselves if they have.
I'm sorry?
They can unmute themselves.
Yeah, we have everyone muted just to cut down on background noise, but if you have a question, you want to unmute yourself, feel free to do that. Not seeing any additional chat questions. And not hearing anyone unmuting themselves, we're going to go ahead and continue then. Oops, I hear someone unmuting. Somebody have a question? Mary McCoy, is that you? Did you have a question? Nope, you just muted your phone again.
Yeah, no, that was by accident. Sorry, Don.
No problem, Mary. All right, so this is what I consider the most important part of this. And that's to kind of see where each other is in the implementation process of graduation pathways. And I've heard through the grapevine and talking to individual folks some creative and some neat stuff that's going on. I've had the pleasure of having some conversation with different school leaders and guidance counselors in terms of things that that schools are doing to gear up, and realizing, the graduation pathways are required to be implemented on 2023, but that means the incoming freshmen that you are providing guidance to in terms of course selection and things like that, are the first graduating class that are required to participate in graduation pathways. In addition to that, schools per student can opt into graduation pathways earlier if a student's struggling in meeting graduation requirements with the current GQE. They can request to opt into that earlier, but they do need to meet all 3 buckets for that particular student if you do opt into the pathways before 2023. So in terms of the discussion groups, we're going to take about the next 25 to 30 minutes. We'll keep you abreast of the time through the chat function, so please watch your chat. What we're going to ask folks to do is to begin with a quick round robin. I think there'll probably be groups of 5 or 6. So please introduce yourself, name, school, position that you have, and your birth month and date. We don't want to know the year because I don't want to get in trouble. And I'll tell you why in just a second, because we're going to need a leader and a recorder. Hopefully you have your discussion questions. I'm going to review them here with you in a second. We need somebody, if not everybody, taking notes in terms of stuff that you discuss, so that can be emailed, and then we will come back and we're going to ask each of the breakout groups to report back and basically share three things. What were some of the best practices that you heard that are worth sharing with the broader group? Were there consistent challenges that schools are facing, and what did you hear that schools need more information on so that they can successfully implement pathways? And here are the high school discussion questions. First, what do you feel your school has done well in terms of grad pathways implementation? Hopefully we'll have some good ideas and best practices. How will your school approach bucket 2, the employability skills? Which of the three options will you take advantage of? And I alluded to some of the criteria for that bucket 2 in terms of the design principles and employability skills benchmarks that you need to be aware of as well. What is your counselor or counselors doing in terms of providing guidance around a broader vision of what to do after graduation? The graduation pathways try to promote, and how do they or will they track pathways for individual students? How will your school approach bucket 3? Will your school be offering any of the workforce options like a CTE concentrator or the credential or certificates or apprenticeships? And if so, how are you going to go about doing that? And is anybody using the kind of less common options, or anybody using the ASVAB or the Cambridge International or CLEP exams? What's the biggest challenge that you face with graduation pathways? And again, what do you need to know more about? So in terms of when you're divided up into the groups, if somebody of the 5 or 6 just says, I'll take leader, and if that same person wants to record, that's fine. If somebody else wants to volunteer to record, that's great as well. If nobody volunteers, the default is, in your introductions, you give birth month and date. Whoever in your group has the closest birth date to today, by default, becomes the leader and recorder. Hopefully somebody will volunteer, but if you need a default, whoever's birth date is closest to today, that's the default leader for your group. Leader and recorder, unless you have volunteers to do that otherwise. So in just a second, Heidi, and I'm going to let Heidi explain to you what's going to happen here.
Okay, so it's pretty easy. I'll just divide up everyone into groups. What will happen is you'll get a pop-up on your screen that will say that the host has invited you to join a specific breakout room, and you just have to click join, and it will allow you to join. Just allow a minute or two for everyone to kind of get their bearings and get into the chat room, and then you can begin. So I will do that now.
And continue to watch your...
couldn't meet until today.
Probably will need to unmute your phones as well if they're not unmuted when you get when they break into the groups, and watch your chat, and we will bring you back into the large group. I'm showing about 10:27 at this point, so probably at about 10 till 11 or around that time, we'll bring you back to the larger group. Good luck, have a good discussion, and we will be kind of joining some of your discussion groups to see how they're going as well.
Make that call.
Okay, folks, great discussion. I was able to kind of jump into each of the different breakout rooms. These were the questions, again, that we asked you to kind of review. And now, what we're going to do is kind of go to each group, although...
Group number 1, and they know which
okay. Hopefully you know what group that you were in, whether they were assigned group 1, 2, 3, and it doesn't really make any difference in what order, as long as the people who are responsible for reporting back do so. Please remember, too, that Anybody who took notes, you probably won't have time to share all of that. So if you would email that to Heidi, you can see her email address here at the bottom of the screen that I'm sharing. One of the groups also found that one of their participants had a tool that they were using for tracking. They're going to send that to us as well. They can send that to Heidi. We'll send that out with the PowerPoint. And if there are other tools that came up in your discussion that you'd like to share out with the whole group, please share that with Heidi as well. So if we can, we'll just start with group number 1. Whoever took lead or was the recorder, whoever wants to report out any kind of best practices that you heard, you know, in terms of what people are doing in terms of implementation. What were some of the consistent challenges, and what do you need more info on? And you have about 3 minutes to do to give that report. Who's going first? Group number 1. Mark. Anybody from group number 1?
Jim is probably the lead on that. I took notes, but Jim probably would be the one to lead that conversation.
Okay. Jim,
all right.
you want to?
I wasn't sure if we were group 1, and we had a lively discussion. The places that we are looking for a bit more time to research were number 1 in CLEP. A lot of us think that could be an option for our students, but we haven't got a lot of information on that. And the second place we spent quite a bit of time was looking at the service-based learning opportunity, particularly what it means to be engaged in a school-based activity such as a co-curricular sport, and found that the document on graduation pathways policy guidance, page 19 C-6, gives quite a bit of explanation about the pieces. And so we're looking forward to working out those details a bit more in what that means, how to document that for our students. Those are probably...
Thanks, Jimmy. Yeah, that was one of the things that you shared, and we're going to follow up with Ben Carter, too, at DOE to get some more guidance on what that looks like in terms of service-based learning and athletic participation. So we'll get that information out via either an update or an email to folks. Anything else from your group, Jim?
Those were the 2 big ones that I think we spent time on. So thanks.
Any best practices, Jim, that you heard, some things that schools are doing that be good for others to be aware of?
I don't know if we listed best practices. One of the things that we were also asking as maybe a 3rd level question was the work-based learning, how to document that for completion of capstone courses or internships or the jobs that our kids are taking. So this form that is being referred to, that some of the larger schools in Evansville and the Catholic diocese were working at, I think that will be a pretty helpful form to get out to our entire group.
Great. And we'll share that with everyone. And you're right, I mean, something was not discussed, but there is the possibility of being able to do something in bucket 2 that also would meet criteria for bucket 3. You know, so they can meet both of those with the same type of project as long as it meets the criteria both for bucket 2 and bucket 3. And that's probably a whole other conversation. But thanks, Jim. I appreciate you taking the lead with that group. How about the next group? And if you don't know your number, whoever's the lead, please just go ahead and jump in. We have 5 groups, so. Group 2? Or another leader, if you don't know your group number. Mark, I know you led one of the groups. How about you?
Oh, wait a minute.
Yeah.
I was muted. I'm number 2 leader, Melanie.
Oh, okay. Go, Melanie. Sorry.
I didn't realize nobody could hear me. Best practice takeaways. I think our schools in the group number 2 we do a lot of the I-STEP remediation to help our students pass that post-secondary competency. And those who have not passed or been successful in the I-STEP, administering the ASVAB. Another thing that was a good takeaway was the service learning projects, both project-based and then more direct and indirect service and tracking that information at the school level. Those were some positives that were shared. Another positive and best practice takeaway that I know at least us at CC might investigate a little bit more is a partnership between Ivy Tech or another community agency. We currently do have a career center. Several of the schools spoke of a career center, like one in Fort Wayne, one in Evansville. But here we're just now beginning to kind of embark on that territory of the career center and how to best use those to meet grad requirements. As far as challenges and what we need more information on, I think deciding who's going to pay for participation in other pathways, that's huge. Also, the additional time and resources it takes for staff to navigate implementation. And then something that came up at the end, which I think is super important as well, is there a way to kind of look at students almost like, you know, we're raising the bar as far as our expectation in some of our high schools. And in many ways we are, you know, directed toward attending high school at the end after, you know, students graduate. But at what cost for some of our students who need to go a pathway? Should we be looking at test scores and things earlier to embark on some of these other options at a younger age? So.
Yeah, and that, you're right, Melanie. That came up in the development of the pathways, is that sometimes many of these pathways occur late in a career, you know, whether it's SAT, ACT, and if students have to pursue different pathways, sometimes it's almost too late. So how do we start looking earlier to make sure that they have, you know, the right options available to them in an earlier time frame, if at all possible?
Yeah.
Thank you. How about group number 3?
At some point, Mark said something that might be helpful to mention in the chat.
Group number 3. How about just whoever the next leader is then? Somebody else who was leading the group, if you don't know which group you were in.
John, this is Mark. Can you hear me?
Yep, I can.
Okay, so we were group 4. You know, it was interesting. We had kind of Marion grouped in with some of the smaller schools, so we are at different spots with regard to like the number of students we're tracking and things like that. But all of us agreed that year 1, you know, we feel a little bit more comfortable with what exactly graduation pathways are. You know, it's taken us a while to even wrap our heads around what's being asked of us and our students. So we all are at least feeling better about understanding the process. We did talk a lot about bucket number 2 with regard to service. Not every school is going to be pursuing a service-based learning experience for bucket number 2. We have a Cristo Rey school that's going to be using the work-based experience, so they're set up pretty well for that. We did have some questions, I think, that were already raised by group number 1 about you know, some sort of rubric to make sure that we can track our service-based learning within each school. You know, and I just chatted out in the window that, you know, I see that there are some rubrics already on the DOE website for extracurricular participation, for club participation. You know, there's some interesting ones there. You know, would there ever be, or can we expect a service-based learning experience checklist or rubric to kind of be there at some point? Or is that something we have to develop internally? So I don't know if any schools are using kind of those checklists. I know, you know, Marion is, for some of our seniors this year, we intend to graduate about, you know, 15 to 20 students on the pathways this year. And then as far as other things in bucket number 3, you know, some of the schools are, you know, their default is all the students kind of have to earn that academic honors diploma, or that's the track for each student. You know, but certainly every school is going to be kind of doing something unique. We all did agree that, you know, based on lack of resources, CTE concentrators and federally recognized apprenticeships might be a little challenging at points. I think, you know, I feel pretty strongly about this too, that, you know, a challenge for faith-based institutions like Marion, you know, the last thing I want to do is farm out the education of our kids for a half a day, you know, where we're trying to, you know, promote a mission-driven education here at the school. You know, and we believe that kind of that encounter within the Catholic Christian community is something that needs to happen between, you know, 7:30 and 4:30. It's going to be a challenge for us to maintain kind of our own adherence to our mission if some of our kids, or a significant amount of our kids, aren't even in our building. So that remains a big challenge for us. And I think the thing we'd like to all know more about is some of those certificates you had mentioned. A QuickBooks certificate, you know, are there places where we can do some of these certification programs within the context of our existing curriculum? And also then the locally created pathway. You know, I've downloaded the application, and that's the extent of how much I've looked at it. You know, and even maybe some PD on, you know, if several of us got together and spent a day or two just kind of hashing out like how to even approach that that process, or even like how to forge a partnership, you know, with an industry or something like that. I mean, I think all of us are looking for ways to maybe look at that locally created pathway a bit more.
That's great, Mark. Thank you. Yeah, and hopefully everybody saw the link that Mark shared out on the chat with from the DOE site, and there's a variety of different things available there. You know, Mark, when you talk about the certificates, I know one of the challenges that with utilizing that option is making sure whoever the instructor is, if you're using people on staff, have the appropriate qualifications. There are required qualifications to be able to provide those certificates, kind of like dual credit requirements. Although I was told some of the lower level certificates, you know, like a QuickBooks, or there's you know, Microsoft Office, I think, or something like that as well, that some of our staff may only need a little bit of additional training to be able to provide some of those. So, you know, that may be an option. I greatly appreciate your comment on, you know, kids being out of the building, you know, half the day, and how do you kind of stay connected to mission. I think that's something that we need to talk about more, and look and see if how many of those CTE kind of concentrators could be provided in-house as well, even if that's in a partnership with something like an Ivy Tech. But yeah, I think there are a lot of inherent challenges as we look at things that take kids away and out of our building on a lot of different levels. But thanks, Mark. How about group number 3 or group number 5?
This is Sally. We had group 5, and really not much different than what's already been shared out this morning. We have several of our schools that are either tracking or are currently utilizing the graduation pathways for their seniors, at least, who might not otherwise qualify to graduate. We have added ASVAB and are seeing some success with that. A couple of our schools have intentionally put some focus back on the ACT, SAT prep coursework, and figuring out ways to broaden that outside of a course and add that into all of the courses across the department to strengthen that. We have increased our participation in CTE courses. We had some providers external from our school. Again, like you mentioned earlier, John, it is a challenge to ensure mission-driven when our students are leaving for half of the day. Also starting to see some challenges within students attending CTE courses and where they may be at within their diploma coursework and actually achieving success within core content areas like Algebra 2 or English 11, and starting to see some conflict about students who maybe not are successful in those and yet are successful in CTE, and figuring out how to get them scheduled. We are starting to see some more online courses being taken for those kiddos, which is probably not the most effective process for them. So that is starting to show up. We focused a lot on service-based learning projects for Bucket 2, and really talked a lot about the reflection at the end of the semester, and that there is a form out there from DOE that refers to 5 kind of questions that students have to reflect on and kind of summarize. I do not have that link. Lisa Beckworth, who had to jump off the call, but she's from Roncalli, brought that up. And so I'll see if I can track down that link from her later and share that out. We did talk a little bit about documentation and ensuring that we're keeping the appropriate things within the service-based learning for the state if they would question that or want to track that. We had a couple of concerns that came up generally about making sure we're communicating clearly with our incoming freshmen. We'd all held freshman orientation nights, and we've started to share that out, but just the continual emphasis to put on that and what should be shared or shouldn't. And then our other questions were surrounding certificates and what that would take to offer, provide those certificates, and what are they. And then also surrounding funding, particularly around if we're going to add IB or AP tests or dual credit, and also the SAT, ACT. It was mentioned that during 2023, when it becomes official, that if we're going to utilize SAT as one of the benchmarks, that we have to offer it during the course of the school day. And so that was new to several of us on the call. And that apparently came from Graduation Pathways Policy Guidance, version 7, page 37, if I got that correct from Ann. And so just trying to look at how we can be proactive on scheduling that as we near that 2023 date.
Good stuff. Thank you, Sally. Last group, is there one more group to report out?
Hey, John, this is Kenny.
Hey, Kenny.
So I think with ours was pretty much everything has already been mentioned. One thing that was brought up was our special ed kids and dealing with getting them to graduate and how to go about making that happen. That was, you know, the only thing that our group brought up that was really different than what's already been mentioned.
And any suggestions coming out in the special ed arena?
Not really. It was mainly a question and how do we handle those. Obviously, there's things that can be written in their IEP and different things like that, but it was just a concern, and nobody really had, and we really didn't have time to explore and answer. It was what came up at the very end.
Okay. Yeah, and that, I mean, that is a challenge that's been discussed from the very beginning with students with special needs. And I think the designers of the process of the pathways kind of thought that, you know, the CTE workforce kind of stuff would help address that, but when you don't have equitable access to those opportunities, that doesn't help a lot of schools to help meet the needs of their students with special needs. So the special needs piece is something we're going to have to continue to work on. Appreciate you mentioning that. Anything else from any of the folks that was not shared that you'd like to share? Just want folks to, well, let me backtrack. Make sure somebody from your group emails your notes. I tried to take notes as folks were reporting out, but don't want to rely on my note taking. So if you would send any of your comments to Heidi at the address hharmon@impea.org, that way we can accumulate that and use that for other planning. Kind of another step, for those of you who are not aware, our Impact Conference is coming up. That's our administrators conference on the 23rd and 24th, and we are doing a whole pre-conference session on graduation pathways. So we'll be able to dig into that a little bit deeper. That's going to be on the 23rd, first thing in the morning at 8:30, hoping that you will be there. You know, and if you find these conversations valuable, if you have ideas about continuing to do this, whether we just want to schedule another web conversation, you know, beginning of next year, or at some point where folks maybe have made some additional progress, IMPA wants to facilitate the networking any way we can so we can continue to learn from each other, not have to recreate the wheel, look for ways that we can work together. So feel free to email Heidi or myself if you have suggestions about how this particular conversation went, or other ways or tools that we can do that would be helpful to you, whether that's reconvening this or even just providing additional information through our IMPEA updates. We've alluded to the DOE website, which is on here, which, like I said, there's a great deal of resources and information there, as well as the state board, and that was a reference to the 58-page document that came out to explain the 4-page graduation pathways document. So that information is there as well. And when these questions come up, those are the best places to go to initially. But Ben Carter has been very, very supportive. He's helping us work on our pre-conference, and I'm sure he would be more than willing to serve as a resource. So don't hesitate to reach out to Ben as well. There's been some, I hope you're all following the chat. I think there's been some good questions there. Angela Miller talked about Project Lead the Way and how they're being able to offer some CTE options through Project Lead the Way. So that's something that I think is worth looking at. Some folks wanted to see the service-based learning, but again, that's on the DOE Graduation Pathways website. So hopefully you found the conversation helpful. It also, in terms of some good things that are going on, as well as that you're all facing some similar challenges. Please let us know if there are other ways that we can support you in the implementation efforts. And if you have other great ideas and things that are going on, please let us know about that as well, and we'll be happy to share that with a larger group. Thanks for taking the time to be a part of this today, and we hope to see you all at Impact 2019 at the Renaissance Hotel in Carmel on September 23rd and 24th, where we'll be continuing this and a variety of other conversations important to our non-public schools. Folks, thanks again. Have a great remainder of the school year. Hope to cross paths with you here sometime soon.
Thank you.